The lecture that follows is about classical Greece, circa 1650 BC to 338 BC. The first major settlement of Greeks occurred in the Sea of Crete on the island of Crete. This civilization was known as Minoan Crete, and it began around 1650 BC. The period known as Classical Greece comes to an end in 338 BC when the Macedonians, under the leadership of the famous Alexander the Great, conquer Greece. It is important to note that to the ancient Greeks, they were not the Greeks. In fact, they called themselves the Hellenes, and the land of ancient Greece, the Hellas. The ancient land of Greece, or the Hellas, was comprised of two main parts. A mainland section, meaning that it was connected to the rest of Europe. That part of ancient and modern Greece is about the size of our state of Louisiana. But ancient and modern Greece is also made up of about 400 islands that are scattered throughout the Ionian Sea, Mediterranean Sea, Sea of Crete, and the Aegean Sea. Ancient Greece and modern Greece is characterized by high mountains, some of them well over 10,000 feet above sea level with snow caps, plains, deep valleys, and rocky, sandy, mountainous type terrain. The Greeks were at a bit of a disadvantage in terms of their geography and environment in ancient times. It was very difficult for them to grow crops. Fortunately, they were surrounded by many harbors, which led them to trade, have access to fish. But agriculture in Greece was difficult, largely because of the mountainous terrain and rocky, sandy soil, but also because the Greeks, unlike the Mesopotamians and Egyptians, had no major river. You may remember that the Mesopotamians relied on the Tigris and Euphrates, while the Egyptians relied on the Nile. The Greeks had creeks, no major rivers, and in fact, many of these creeks in ancient Greece and modern Greece are seasonal. They dry up in the summer. So the land of ancient Greece was not without its problems. We know that around 2000 BC, the first Greeks had made contact with each other, had scattered settlements, but gradually came together to form various settlements. The first and most important was on Crete. It was called the Minoan Crete civilization for a legendary king by the name of Minos. Minoan Crete lasted from about 1650 BC to about 1450 BC. What we know about Minoan Crete is largely based on archaeological evidence. And when one hears that, then we usually assume, okay, well, there must not be any written records because history is the recorded memory of mankind. It's based on written record and documents. Well, actually, we have many, many, many written records from Minoan Crete. However, these records were written in a strange language called Linear A, which still to this day remains undeciphered by scientists, scholars, historians. It remains a mystery. So what we know about Minoan Crete comes from legend and from archaeological evidence. So what do we think we know about Minoan Crete? Well, it appears that Minoan Crete was a peaceful civilization of Greeks. Also must have been very wealthy because there were many, many palaces scattered throughout that island. The largest was at a place called Knossos, which we assume must have been the capital of Minoan Crete. It appears that this was a rich civilization that traded with Egypt and the mainland of Greece. And from legend, we know that they had a king by the name of Minos. What exactly happened to this short-lived Minoan Crete civilization remains a bit of a mystery. Minoan Crete only lasted as a major Greek settlement for 200 years. The cause of its decline and fall remains a great mystery. It is somewhat assumed today that Minoan Crete fell to another group of Greeks by the name of the Mycenaeans. This brings us to the Mycenaean settlement, which flourished from 1650 BC to 1000 BC on the mainland of Greece. Again, what we know about the settlement at Mycenae in Greece is largely based on archaeological evidence as well, because here too, the writing that was left behind for us, called Linear B, has not been totally deciphered. We've had more luck with it than with Linear A, but what we know about this settlement still is based largely on archaeological evidence and on legend. What we know about Mycenae is that this area in mainland Greece had a very complicated political system in which there were several kings, about 6 of them, who were to share the area of Mycenae. This did not work, and Mycenae was characterized by much internal strife or civil war, as each of these various kings tried to assert his power over others. Around 1000 BC, Mycenae came to an end. What caused its collapse remains a bit of a mystery, but there are 3 possible theories. Some historians say that the mysterious sea peoples came in and wiped out Mycenae. Others say that a group of mysterious Greek-speaking people from the north, called the Dorians, wiped out Mycenae. But then there's a large contingent of historians who believe that Mycenae probably collapsed from internal strife or warfare between those various kings. With the collapse of Mycenae, Greece enters into a period known as the Greek Dark Age. But before we assume that this period is a complete and total loss, let me go ahead and tell you that it is during the Greek Dark Age that Homer will write his Iliad and Odyssey, more about that later, and we will have the settlements of Sparta and Athens coming to the forefront. More about that later too. The Greek Dark Age began around 1100 BC and lasted to 800 BC. This is a period in Greek history that is characterized by poverty, disruption, backwardness, chaos, illiteracy. A Dark Age is always a period filled with horrible times for a civilization, and Greece experienced many problems in this 300-year period. It's one of the only times, too, in recorded history that we see people who were formerly literate becoming illiterate. It's almost like they forget how to read and write over this period of about 300 years. One of the, I guess we could say, positive developments that comes out of the Greek Dark Age, besides the development of Athens and Sparta and the writings of Homer, is colonization. It is during the Greek Dark Age that many Greeks decide to leave Greece with its problems, leave them behind. They put their families and what little bit they had from their homes into boats and sailed out across the Ionian, Mediterranean, and Aegean seas and settled on various islands, and even went into Turkey, Spain, France, and Italy. So Greek culture and Greek ethnicity was spread to many areas during the Greek Dark Age. The Greek Dark Age, fortunately, only lasted 300 years, and it gave way to a flowering of Greek civilization, or really the high point, the development of Greek civilization as we know it. This brings us to a brief discussion of politics in Greece. During the end of the Greek Dark Age, we see developing across mainland Greece various settlements of Greek peoples. These Greek peoples formed what were called polises. Now we have to remember that ancient Greece, and modern Greece today too, of course, characterized by a very mountainous terrain, but in ancient Greece, this very mountainous terrain served to divide the Greeks. Greeks tended to settle in valleys between the mountains, and their loyalty was not to other Greeks or to Greece as a whole. In fact, Greece was not a unified civilization like Egypt. We have to really associate Greek development sort of being akin to what we saw in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was comprised of various city-states that were independent, autonomous, doing their own thing. That's exactly the case in Greece. A Greek would not have defined himself as a Greek or a Hellene first and foremost. When Greeks introduced themselves to each other, they would have said, I'm so-and-so and I am Spartan or Athenian. A person identified himself or herself by loyalty to the polis or city-state or valley in which he or she lived. The Greeks were not united. So in the valleys between the various mountains in ancient Greece, we have the development of city-states called polis in ancient Greece. Every polis shared a basic organization. Whether you're talking about Athens, Sparta, Samos, Lesbos, Thermopylae, any of these areas would have been organized the same way. Inside a polis, you would find two basic characteristics. Though a polis would vary in size from place to place and in government type, all polises shared two commonalities. Every polis had an acropolis and an agora. The acropolis inside the polis or city-state was the highest point in elevation. There, on an acropolis in the city-state, you would find temples and religious structures dedicated to the patron god or goddess of that city-state or polis. The ancient Greeks were polytheistic, and they had 12 gods that they considered to be supreme. These gods were called the Olympian gods because it was believed they lived on Greece's highest mountain called Mount Olympus. So of all of these 12 gods, each city-state would have chosen one or two as their patron god or goddess and dedicated the temples and religious structures on the Acropolis to that particular god or goddess. Also, inside the city-state or polis, you would find what was called an agora. This was an open-air marketplace. It was a place that people gathered on a daily basis to exchange news, gossip, talk about what was going on in the city-state. It was also the shopping market for all of the people who lived in that city-state. It was like an open-air, outdoor mall or marketplace where people could come and get water from a common well, barter and exchange fruits and vegetables with each other, as well as discuss news and gossip. So the agora was a meeting place. Now, every polis had an acropolis and an agora, but every polis varied in size and government type. In ancient Greece, we find in the various city-states or polises which developed after the Greek Dark Age, various forms of government. These include monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. Monarchy meant to the Greeks rule by one or a king. Now, this was not invented, monarchy was not invented by the Greeks. As we saw, there were monarchies in the city-states of Mesopotamia, and Egypt was a monarchy as well. The Greeks actually did not like monarchy. In fact, after their settlements at Minoa and Mycenae, monarchy was their least favored form of government. So they didn't invent monarchy, and they didn't especially like it. They did invent the other forms: aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. Aristocracy meant rule by the rich, and the most famous city-state or polis in ancient Greece that was an aristocracy ruled by the rich was Athens. Most people associate Athens with democracy, but Athens did not begin as a democratic polis. They began around 700 BC as an aristocracy. Oligarchy was also invented by the ancient Greeks. Oligarchy means rule by a few, and this was a very complicated system and varied from city-state to city-state. We'll talk more about it in just a bit when we talk about Sparta. Sparta was the most famous oligarchy from ancient Greece. Oligarchy, along with democracy, were the most common governmental types in ancient Greek city-states. Democracy means rule by the people, and it was characterized by public debate. All citizens, meaning males, were allowed to participate in the political process either directly by holding office or indirectly by voting. Tyranny today, for us, has a negative connotation. In ancient Greece, the word tyranny or tyrant was not a negative word. Tyranny simply meant rule by a tyrant. A tyrant was someone who had come to power by illegal or unethical means. He may have seized control of the government, which we thought, that is negative. But what we have to understand is tyranny to the ancient Greeks meant that the tyrant had come to power possibly in a negative way, illegally or unconstitutionally, but it was no reflection on the leader's ability to rule. A tyrant may have come to power illegally, but he could be an exceptionally good leader. So, let's talk about the two most famous city-states or polises in ancient Greece. They are Sparta and Athens. We begin with Sparta. Sparta began as a city-state or polis around 700 BC. Sparta had a major problem right from the start. Located on what we call the Peloponnesus, Sparta's major problem was that it had very little land and a huge growing population. So by the 700s BC, really from the start of Spartan history, there was a major problem. Land hunger, meaning there's not enough land to support the people, and overpopulation. So the leaders who were in control of Sparta got together to talk about some possible solutions for this problem. We have too many people, not enough land, what to do about it? Well, here were some of the options that they considered and tried. It was suggested and tried that they have a lottery, and the individuals who won the lottery got the prize of being exiled and banished from Sparta. Oh, you win, you have to leave. This worked, but not well. They also came up with the idea that possibly they could have a war. Maybe through war, they would lose some of their population and maybe gain some land, so maybe that would work, but who would they declare war on and how would this work? Well, meanwhile, some other individuals in control of Sparta suggested colonization. And maybe we just take Spartans and we send them to some other place in Greece and start a new settlement of Spartans. They did do this, but it was not effective enough, so they came back to the idea of war, conquest, to solve the problem. So the immediate solution was the neighboring city-state, a place called Messenia or Messenia. Either pronunciation is correct. Messenia was a neighboring polis to Sparta, and what the Spartans saw was the opposite situation. Whereas Sparta had a big population and a little bit of land, Messenia had a small population and a great deal of land. So the idea was, for the Spartan government, they should declare war on Messenia, take it over, take the land from the Messenian people, and while they were at it, just take over the Messenians and make them their slaves, or as they called it, their helots. The problem with this is that Sparta has a very small, not so good army at this point. And I know you're thinking, now wait a minute, if I know anything about Sparta in the history of ancient Greece, the Spartans had a phenomenal army. It's true, but not yet. It's because of the Messenian Wars that the Spartans developed a mighty military state. Those in charge realized that to win the Messenian Wars, Sparta would have to totally transform itself into a rigorous, rigid military state. This led to what was called the Lycurgan Regimen. This was an attempt to unify Sparta to make it a strong, efficient military state. So, to gain victory in the Messenian Wars from 735 BC to 620 BC, the Spartans had to totally transform themselves into a military state to gain victory over the neighboring city-state or polis of Messenia. Again, what did they want from Messenia? Land and slave labor. The Lycurgan Regimen led to major changes in Sparta. The Messenian Wars led to major changes in Sparta. First and foremost, the government of Sparta officially became an oligarchy, remember, which means rule by a few, and in Sparta the oligarchy was very complex. If you'd like to know more about this, you can read about it in your textbook, but their government consisted of 2 kings, 5 men called overseers, 28 elders, and an assembly of all Spartan citizens. Also, they gained helots as a result of the Messenian Wars. The Spartans were able to transform themselves into a strong enough military state to gain control over the land of Messenia and its people. The helots were Messenians who were defeated in the Messenian Wars by Sparta and made their slaves. The Messenians did every necessary job in Sparta after the Messenian Wars. The Spartans enslaved their neighbors and turned them into farmers, craftsmen, etc. They did all of the necessary jobs in Sparta so that the Spartans could concentrate on their newly created permanent standing army. In fact, the helots were also repeatedly and routinely terrorized by the Spartans just to keep them in their place. It was considered a rite of passage from childhood or boyhood to manhood for a Spartan youth to kill a Messenian helot and get away with it uncaptured, unnoticed. So the Messenian Wars were a victory for Sparta. Sparta gained rich, fertile soil from their neighbors and used their neighbors as a slave labor force called helots to do all of the work of the Spartans so that Spartan men could concentrate on serving in the assembly of the oligarchy of Sparta and also serve in the army. So what was the job of the women? Well, their job is to make soldiers for the army. More about that in just a second. As a result of the Lycurgan Regimen and the Messenian Wars, Sparta gained a permanent standing army. This meant an army that was ready in peacetime and in wartime. The Lycurgan Regimen resulted in the life of a Spartan man being completely and totally scheduled and regulated. There was no such thing as freedom for a Spartan male. Every aspect of his life was predetermined by the government, by the Lycurgan Regimen. For example, at the age of 0, and what we mean by that is newborn, a newborn was judged fit to live. Okay, now some of this is a little bit strange, admittedly, from a modern American perspective, but the idea ran that if Sparta was going to maintain control over its neighbor, Messenia, had to be a civilization, a settlement of strong, able-bodied men and women. Sparta felt that they had no room for quote-unquote weaklings. So at the age of 0, when a baby was first born, a council of elders in every community would come and judge that baby, whether it was male or female. So every child at birth was judged by a council of elders from the community, and if the child was seen as having an obvious physical impairment, such as some sort of deformity, or if it was seen as weak, even in personality at birth, okay, if it didn't have a strong enough cry or whatever, they would determine that the child was unfit to live. So the Spartans practiced infanticide, the murder of infants. And what they would do is simply remove the child from the parents' home. And yes, the parents went along with this. They knew, I'm sure it hurt them, but they knew the expectations when they lived in Sparta. So the child would be taken from the parents and taken to one of the neighboring mountains that surrounded the valley, the polis of Sparta, and the child would be abandoned to die. Now, how it died, nobody cared. It could die from starvation or exposure to the elements, to the weather. It could have been eaten by a wild animal. Who knows? They didn't care. Okay, now after the age of 0, girls are pretty much left alone. Boys are not. Boys have a short childhood in Sparta. They get to play and be little kids until the age of 7. At the age of 7, they were taken away from their homes and placed in military barracks. It's important to note that at the age of 7, they were not officially soldiers. They're just getting ready to be. So at the age of 7, they're taken to live in military barracks, and they were treated awfully. They were beaten by older boys. They were forced to sleep outside on mats made out of reeds without the benefit of a blanket. They were fed very little. The typical meal was blood and vinegar soup. No, this would not have been yummy or appealing, but it served the purpose of giving basic nutrition. They were exercised and trained brutally and harshly, and the reason for this was to make them tough and mean. If they couldn't stand this kind of thing, they would never survive warfare. That was the idea. Now, these boys are not allowed to have associations really outside of the barracks. So as they become adolescents and enter into puberty, of course, certain hormonal changes and physical changes would happen, which would lead to the awakening of certain sorts of desires among these young boys, and they were encouraged by the Spartan government and the Spartan military to engage in same-sex relations with each other. Homosexuality was actually encouraged among the Spartan soldiers. It was not seen as a weakness. In fact, it was seen as something that would make the army stronger, because these young boys would develop bonds of attachment, love, and affection for each other. As a result, they would be willing to fight on the battlefield harder to impress each other and be less likely to desert each other if they were, in fact, lovers. At the age of 20, these young boys officially enter into military service. They've just been practicing for 13 years. They officially become soldiers at the age of 20. At the age of 20, they were allowed to marry a Spartan girl, but they had to remain in the military barracks. I find it somewhat interesting, the marriage practices of Sparta at this time. When a woman married in Sparta, she was not allowed to dress in a special way for the occasion. Now, let me just go ahead and say that in Sparta, what was considered beautiful for a Spartan woman was to be very plain. They did not adorn themselves with makeup and perfume and jewelry and fancy clothes and hairstyles. That was considered to be luxurious behavior that was not condoned in Sparta. Spartan men and women were supposed to be hard and efficient, not worried about things like their appearance. So women were normally quite plain in Sparta, but were also very buff. They worked out very hard, were athletic themselves. The idea was that if you had athletic men and women mating with each other, you would create better soldiers for the Spartan army and better mothers, wives, and sisters for Spartan soldiers. So even on a wedding day, a Spartan woman was not allowed to adorn herself. She wore her typical toga type outfit, more or less like a linen cloth draped across her body with sandals. But on the honeymoon night, the wedding night, a Spartan woman was required to wear men's clothing and men's sandals and wait for her new husband in the dark. Now, I think you can probably figure out the reasoning behind this is that to this point, for 13 years, all her husband is known as a life with men, and so having his new wife dress as a man on the wedding night is supposed to ease him into this transition from his old life of relations with just men to now including a woman. So, anyhow, at the age of 20, a man was allowed to marry, but he had to stay in the barracks. At the age of 30, a man was allowed to leave the military barracks, still a soldier though, and he has to drop everything else he's doing at a moment's notice to defend the polis of Sparta if called upon to do so. So at 30, the man can live at home and vote and take on a job if he wants to. A man was not officially discharged from the Spartan army until he turned 60 years old. So I think you can see from the Lycurgan regimen that a man's life in Sparta was not his own life. Every aspect of his life was predetermined for him. Many historians have said that while men in Sparta had very little freedom, women were extremely liberated. And that makes good sense if you think about it, because women in Sparta were without their husbands, their fathers, their sons. Where were the men? In the barracks, training to be soldiers, or off at war, fighting for the good of the polis of Sparta. So women ran the house in Sparta, they owned land, and they led very open public lives. They exercised vigorously, they paraded around in the nude, sang in the nude, they were buff, very great physical specimens, strong. They were not encouraged to be soft in personality or demeanor or in body. I will point out that historians say that Spartan women were very free and liberated because they were allowed to parade and exercise and sing in the nude. That sounds kind of funny at first, and you wonder, what is this about? Well, they were supposed to work out, be very physically fit so that they would be less likely to have a child born with deformity, it was believed. But the singing part was very important in Sparta because when women worked out and paraded about in the nude, they sang songs about soldiers from their neighborhoods and their own families. This gave women the power to make or break a Spartan man's reputation. He did not want to be the subject of a song sang by these women that talked about his cowardice in battle. So women had literally the power to make a man's reputation or break it by their singing. Women in Sparta, as I said previously, were not allowed to wear makeup or jewelry or perfume. They were supposed to be very strict in their demeanor and in their personalities. They were not the way we usually think of women as being very soft and nurturing. Women in Sparta had an important role to play, and that was the production of soldiers for Sparta. So to make sure that this happened in Sparta, trial marriages, quote-unquote, were allowed. A Spartan man would marry at the age of 20 a Spartan woman, and if the union did not quickly result in the production of a child, the two could part and go their separate ways. Eventually, you can imagine that if a person suffered from some sort of infertility, that person would eventually find himself or herself without a mate at all, because the purpose of marriage, first and foremost in Sparta, was to produce soldiers. So, if a marriage did not work out in Sparta, there was actually divorce. Women and men in Sparta focused on strength and conformity. What we mean by that is that in Sparta, there was no room for literature, arts, poetry, creativity, science, philosophy. None of that existed in Sparta. Sparta was all about the army, conformity. If you think about it, it makes good sense. In the military state, you don't have room for individual freedoms and creativity that would be dangerous to the mainstream. You couldn't have anybody who was a free thinker, because they would come up with alternatives to the way the Spartans lived. In fact, it's interesting to note that Sparta had the best military, without question, in ancient Greece, but oftentimes refused to use it. When called upon by other city-states for backup or help, the Spartans often refused to participate, or I should say the Spartan government refused to participate. Their logic was that in the course of battle, if Spartans were to talk with men from other Greek city-states like the Athenians, they would find out that there were other ways to live. Free, democratic-type societies would have much been preferable to the life in Sparta. So it was considered dangerous many times by the Spartan government to send their men into battle where they would be exposed to radical ideas of personal choice and freedom. I should also point out to you that women, as I said before, were not known in Sparta for their softness, for their nurturing abilities. Women were expected to be just as hard as the men. It was said of Spartan women, when they sent their men off into battle, whether it was a husband, father, son, brother, boyfriend, husband-to-be, a Spartan woman was not allowed to cry, complain about how lonely she would be, or how she would miss the man in her life. None of that. What she was required to do by law was to give her man, whatever he happened to be, father, husband, whatever, a stern piece of advice. Spartan women told their men when they set off to battle, "Come home carrying your shield high, or come home on it." And that really summarizes life in Sparta. In Sparta, a man's role was to win victory for the city-state of Sparta, meaning to come home with his shield high, carried in victory, or to come home dead on it. For the Spartans, there was no in-between. You fought until you could fight no more. You fought literally to the death. When we read about the Spartans in battle, we often find what appears to be, from our perspective, that they would fight against incredible, ridiculous odds and never surrender. Surrender was just another form of cowardice to the Spartans, so they would literally commit suicide rather than surrender, because that was cowardice. So a Spartan man would fight to the death. He would never give up, never surrender, even in the face of impossible odds, ridiculous odds. He would never, ever surrender. He would die instead. So when I say suicide, I don't mean that a Spartan man would turn his sword on himself. He would fight the enemy until he was killed. There was no such thing as surrender. The next city-state that we're going to talk about is Athens. Athens, unlike Sparta, is known for its intellectual, cultural, and artistic pursuits. In Greek history, the two most famed city-states or polises were Sparta and Athens, and they were complete opposites. Sparta was known for its very strict, regimented military state. Athens was known for its creativity, its arts, its philosophy. In fact, most of the Greeks that you have ever heard of before, like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, any of the various Greeks who've made contributions to math, science, literature, drama, philosophy, the arts, etc., most of them were Athenian. So let's talk about Athens. Athens had major problems from 621 to 508 BC. These problems were economic and social. And if you want to read about this in your textbook, feel free to do so, but it's a very complicated period, so let's just suffice it to say that by 621 BC, Athens, which was an aristocracy ruled by the rich, was not working for the common people. The common people of Athens were struggling to make a living. All of the land was held by the rich. The rich weren't giving up the land. The average person felt overburdened, overtaxed, and desired a change. The three men who played the most important role in changing Athens for the better were Draco, Solon, and Cleisthenes. Their ideas resulted in democracy for Athens. Democracy in Athens is extremely complex, and you can read about it in your text if you would like. But for our purposes, we'll just simplify it. The democracy in Athens was a complex system of tribes, demes, citizens' assemblies, and various offices. In other words, there are different levels to the democracy of Athens, different government positions. It's really not important that we know about that. What we need to know about are the ideas behind democracy, because our founding fathers, the men who drafted the Constitution of the United States of America, were absolutely, totally enamored with the Athenian concept of democracy. So what I'm about to tell you about Athenian democracy is going to sound extremely familiar because it is our system. The Athenians, under the leadership of Draco, Solon, and Cleisthenes, created a democracy with various offices, assemblies, demes, tribes. But the ideals behind democracy are what are most important. Public debate was held about issues, legislation, discussions. Before a law was passed or enacted, public debate would occur in the Agora in Athens. People would show up to listen, to hear what the newest law was all about. They would make suggestions. The officers, all of them in Athens, were elected by the citizens, and there was majority rule. Voting was actually held in Athens. Now, I know to us this seems like, so what? Well, it's a huge big deal because this had never existed before Athens. Mesopotamia, Egypt, none of the other Greek city-states came up with the idea of democracy. It was Athens. This is a brand new idea. So, when a law was up for debate, the citizens of Athens, meaning all males, would show up, they'd listen, they'd speak out. We'd like to see the law include this, that, or the other thing. And then an election would be held. Men, citizens, would take a rock and they would drop it into a vessel for the law or against. The pebbles or rocks would be tallied and majority rule. So if there were more rocks for the law than against it, it would be passed. If more people voted against it than for it, the law was not enacted. So there was majority rule, public debate, all officers were elected. Sounds great. However, were exceptions. Foreigners, that means anybody from a city-state or other area outside of Athens, were not allowed to participate in democracy. resident aliens, meaning basically the same thing as foreigners, people who had come from other areas and other city-states, were never allowed to participate in the democracy of Athens. And of course, women could not participate. Women in Athens had one major role. They were protected by law only to protect the husband's property. So a woman was seen as property. She was protected by law as a husband's property. Her job, first and foremost, was to produce sons who would be citizens of Athens. Women in Athens were not considered to be worthwhile, just to put it quite bluntly. Athens was so-called a boys' club because it was the men in Athens who ran the show, and they insisted on gender separation and segregation even in their households. Not only were females excluded from politics, they were not allowed even to go to the agora to hear public debate. In fact, an Athenian woman was not allowed to leave her home without a man from her family accompanying her to the agora. It's like Athenian men were so obsessed with their women's behavior. They were so afraid that their women would be unfaithful or cheat on them. So a husband would accompany his wife to the agora to make sure that she did not get into trouble, quote unquote, or he would send a son to accompany the wife and mother to the agora. Women in Athens had no social or personal freedoms, not even really in their house. In Athens, homes were segregated into male and female quarters. The males lived on the bottom floor, females on the top. Okay, let me explain. Father and sons on the bottom floor, mom and daughters on the top floor. If the house was one story, they were still separated on different ends of the houses. Athenian men and women did not sleep together. Sleeping together and having sexual relations with each other were not the same thing. They shared the bed only for the purpose of procreation. Athenian men had some strange ideas, I guess we could say, about sexual relations. They felt that relations with their wives should be only for the procreation of children. Recreational sexual activity was done with prostitutes and other Athenian males. So let me just say here that I need to give you a little information that may not be appropriate for all audiences. So I'll give you a second to pause here in case you want to remove small children or anyone that you don't want to hear a little bit of a frank discussion about sexuality in Athens. Okay, let us say that in Athens, homosexuality was very common with no stigma attached whatsoever. In fact, it was considered to be a rite of passage. It was what made a man a man. Typically, a young boy, and see today by our standards, we would call this child molestation or pedophilia, but in ancient Athens, a young boy would be taken from his home by an older male. This older man would come and he would present a gift, usually a chicken, to the family of this young boy, and he would say, "I'm going to take your son." And the parents agreed to this. This was just a part of the accepted way of life in Athens. And the young boy would be taken by this older man who would teach him what it meant to be a man in Athens, about democracy and sports, and he would act as a mentor to him. But there was also a sexual aspect to the relationship. Now, when a man married, he was supposed to give up homosexual relations, but many did not. And in fact, many Athenian husbands spent their nights away from their wives so that they could engage in sexual relations of their own choosing with female prostitutes called courtesans and sometimes with young boys and older males. So, enough of that, but it is important for you to understand it. Going back here, let's say that while women were treated poorly in reality, they were often idealized in literature and arts, but invisible in reality, meaning that in real life, women were considered to be relatively unimportant, but when a philosopher or a writer would create some work of art, poetry, piece of literature, he would often idealize a woman as beautiful and perfect. So it's just a really strange contradiction of ideas in Athens about sex and gender roles. Again, let us say that Athens was famed for its arts and philosophy, and I know you think that probably I haven't said as much about Athens as I did about Sparta. That is because when we talk about philosophy, arts, science, and mathematics in a later lecture about the Greeks, you're going to hear all about famous Athenians and their contributions in these various areas. So what I wanted to do in this particular part of the lecture was just introduce you to the differences between Athens and Sparta. In the next lecture about Greece, we will focus on the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. That lecture will be much shorter than this one. The third and final lecture about the Greeks will focus on their contributions to Western civilization in history, art, philosophy, literature, drama, teaching, sports, math, science, and medicine. And then in Chapter 4, we'll talk about the conquest of Greece by Alexander the Great.